Hello and welcome to Chinese Whispers Podcast UK, the podcast that looks at statistics and how they're abused in modern politics. You can follow us on YouTube, iTunes or Facebook. Today we're going to be looking into how much the NHS actually pays to private companies. This is a sore subject for a lot of people because they feel like it's undermining the NHS. This was demonstrated by the 250,000 signatures that were signed against it and the 96% consensus against Health and Social Care Act in 2012 by doctors and nurses. The 96% consensus may not be 100% accurate. You have to take this with a bit of pinch of salt, but this is not the main area of this podcast. As we've known with previous ones, we focus on one statistic and go into it. Arguing over whether privatisation is good or bad is just too complex, and we cannot really give it justice in such a short podcast. So, looking at the budget for contracts, the NHS puts aside 10 billion. This is generally agreed. There's some other stats that are saying it's 9 point something billion, and some are saying it's just the high 10 billions, but we'll, for the simplicity, just say it's 10 billion. Unsurprisingly, there's been a lot of hype and twisting of the facts. This podcast wouldn't really be running if this didn't really happen on a daily basis in politics. To get a prime example of this, we can look at The Guardian. The Guardian has written 3 major articles on this, all written by one journalist called Dennis Campbell. Dennis Campbell is the health correspondent for The Guardian. However, this is really confusing when you actually follow it in a chronological order. He first writes in 2014 that there is a prediction that the private firms will win up to 9 billion of the funding for contracts. He doesn't actually give a date for this prediction, and he also uses a very deceptive reasoning. He says that it's because of the 50% achievement rate. So he says because private companies are achieving 50% of the contracts, if they continue to do this, they'll outshadow NHS suppliers. However, if you flip this on its head, you can say that the NHS also achieved 50%. So NHS suppliers will greatly outnumber private companies. Also, we have to question this 50% achievement rate. I've looked and I can't really find it anywhere. But it doesn't really just stop there. We go further. 4 months later, in 2014, Campbell writes another article, and he says that £10.02 billion goes to private, and this is because of bailouts and shortages due to the NHS. So there's a huge discrepancy before the actual in 4 months. The strangeness doesn't just stop there. In 2015, he then writes another article saying that 36.8% of the contracts are won by private companies. This is very bizarre. If we're going to believe his previous articles, that means that there's a 6.55 billion reduction in the last year in terms of giving money to private companies. So even though The Guardian on general is saying that the NHS is being privatised and we're against it, they've been so inconsistent in their articles here that you would have to make the conclusion that spending has greatly reduced when it comes to the private section. The BBC and The Times also cover this, but The Guardian is by far the worst and the most inconsistent when it comes to covering how much money is given to. Campbell also seems confused with other issues in health. He writes about clinics and surgeries being cancelled at the last minute due to doctors and nurses striking. He then writes a couple of months later that the shortages and cancellations in surgery is down to private companies providing poor care. Journalists that contradict themselves within 4 months should be treated with caution. Another distributor of spurious facts is the NHS Support Federation. This is a pressure group that asks for donations and membership fees. However, they claim that 70% of contracts are won by private companies. However, when you actually look at the methodology and the way they actually collect this, you find that they only actually measure 2 websites where contracts are actually put on advert by the NHS. This is not a great representation of all the contracts. In fact, it's outright misleading. We then go on to the BBC. They state that 6% of contracts are taken and owned by private companies, and there's a 0.4% increase on average over the last 8 years. If we look at the actual increase, in 2014 there was a 0.6% increase, and in 2007 there was a 0.6% increase. So at the present data that we have, all we can say is the increase is linear. It's not increasing exponentially. People who are claiming doomsday and that it's increasing at an alarming rate really do not have the data. I know what you're thinking. BBC is just one source. But then we go to the Times and it has the same percentage and actually calls out the NHS Support Federation. Then we go to the King's Fund. It's an independent think tank and it's very open at criticising the government in the way it handles the NHS. Whilst it says the reforms actually fragment leadership and make it harder to coordinate care, they also say that 6% of contracts are taken over by private companies, and the privatisation is a big hype, and there's a lot of political groups that are hyping it up for their own gain. So here we have both sides. We have three sources that are all consistent with each other. We have another source that is inconsistent and deceptive with the methodology, and then we have The Guardian, which is inconsistent within 4 months, written by the same journalist. Looking at this snapshot, we can say it's safe to actually state that the current holding for private companies is 6%. But why do people abuse this? And how is it abused in politics? We don't have to look very far. The National Health Action Party, which is a group of doctors who have clubbed together to try and save the NHS, jumps onto the bandwagon by brandishing the 70% done by the NHS Support Federation. The National Health Action Party also is taking steps to be misleading. They have a list of publications and news articles, and then they write a short caption as to summarising what it's actually saying. They cite the 3 Guardian articles and fail to make the point that they're inconsistent with each other. And then they cite the BBC article that we just talked about to make the point that a third of the contracts are done by private companies. We have to make note that a third of contracts is not the same as a third of the NHS budget. What they do when citing the BBC article is that they completely fail to recognise that the BBC article is stating that it's 6% of the budget. They use the BBC article to say a third of contracts, and then they use the Guardian article to say 36.8% of the budget is for private companies. They are directly cherry-picking parts of articles that they want whilst ignoring the rest of the article. If you trust the article, you'll trust all of what it says, or you'll explain why certain areas are not true, not completely ignore it. This is outright disingenuous. Of course, this doesn't mean that outright privatisation or moderate privatisation of the NHS is impossible. It also doesn't try to answer the issue of whether privatising or keeping it national is the right way to go. This is up to your own decision, and as I said before, you can not do this justice in such a short podcast. This podcast has been pretty short, but it's simply because it's an open and closed case in terms of the statistics on this one. The ones who are calling doomsday due to the contracts are so obviously inconsistent and display such basic errors in terms of being disingenuous. There's no real in-depth analysis needed. However, I must stress the focus of this podcast and the scope of it. This only covers the amount that's being given out in contracts to private companies. We can't really explore, and we will not do it justice to explore property being sold, etc., or people using NHS resources to carry out private work. Complexity and the NHS go hand in hand, especially when it comes to privatisation. But hopefully in the future you'll be able to know that this statistic cut through the rubbish and see who's being outright disingenuous. The National Health Action Party does have some very honest views in terms of it wants to create a national health and it wants to protect that, and people can say that's quite honourable. However, they are going about it in a very disingenuous manner, and there are other people who do this as well. They do it for the greater good, and hopefully you will not be sucked into this in the future. Next podcast we'll be looking into the Ferguson riots, and also if the police were